Question. I am totally lost when it comes to the state of politics in the world. I try to go down so many rabbit holes, but contradictions and uncertainties was all I found. Now so many friends and acquaintances in spiritual circles are all into the Trump-Musk thing, but I just cannot support this with my soul energy. Something about the MAGA movement doesn't sit right at all. Certainly not the other option either. So again, this terrible feeling of loneliness and uncertainty. Can you comment on this? Well, I think the person is raising a very important question, which is spiritual people and their engagement with politics. And because it's so important, I'll comment on it from several different angles. But just to react to the question itself, I cannot support this with my soul energy, and all I found was uncertainties and contradictions. Okay, but who says that as a spiritual person you have to be engaged in politics? There are many spiritual people that I know that don't pay much attention to politics because they are focused on their own spiritual growth. Myself, after I found a spiritual path when I was 18 years old, at that time I had no engagement or no interest in politics, and for many years I just focused on my spiritual growth and resolving my psychology. And I don't see any problem with that, if that's what you feel is right for you, and especially if you feel like you're being pulled into this reactionary pattern with politics. Nothing wrong with withdrawing. Now this doesn't mean, mind you, it doesn't mean I say spiritual people shouldn't be engaged with politics, because I've said in several videos that we live in a transition phase here between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, which I think most spiritual people recognize. And as I've explained several times, the model that was common in the age of Pisces was the spiritual people would withdraw from the world and live in a secluded setting and just focus on spiritual growth. But in the Aquarian age, it's more important that we actually don't withdraw from the world, but we engage in the world. However, engaging in the world doesn't mean you have to engage in politics or that you have to do it in the same way other people do it. So you could say there is no standard answer to how spiritual people should deal with politics, because I've explained many times we all have an individual life plan that you made along with your spiritual teachers before you came into this lifetime. So it's very important to tune into that intuitively and see, is there an area of society that you wanted to engage in, that you put in your divine plan that you wanted to engage in? And is that an area you're wanting to improve society, but it's not necessarily from a political point of view. See, it can be bringing forth some better way of doing things in a particular field. But it's not political. It's about improving society. And just to give you a silly example, I mean, inventing a better mousetrap, as the saying goes, what's political about it? How is that political? Helping people resolve their psychology, helping society find a better way to deal with this problem or that problem. Not everything in society is political. So that's the next thing. If you find that it is in your divine plan to engage in politics in some way, then I would say, as a spiritual person, consider very carefully whether there is a different way to engage in politics than what you see has become so common over the last couple of decades, where politics have become so polarized. And with that I mean really that there are certain aspects of society that really are not dependent on party politics, because there are certain universal aspects of what works best for people, what works best for society. So what I'm saying is that it is actually possible to find a way to approach politics that's neutral. And just another silly example. If I'm holding up this and letting go, it's going to fall down, right? because there's a universal law of gravity. And whether I am a born-again Marxist, as the Marxist I met in college when I was young, or a confirmed capitalist, well, it's just going to fall down either way because it's a natural law. The same thing with many things that are now considered political. They really do have a universal component. I mean, the economy works a certain way, and you can polarize it, but there are certain principles that just don't change whether you're on this side or that side of the political spectrum. So what I'm saying is that I think there's a huge opportunity for spiritual people to engage in politics in such a way that we bring a different perspective, a neutral perspective. And look what the person is saying here. I tried to go down so many rabbit holes, but contradictions and uncertainties was all I found. Well, I think that's because you allowed yourself to go into these polarized opinions instead of trying to rise above them. This is what the Buddha 2,500 years ago called the middle way, where you're not pulled into what he called the pairs, which is what I today call the duality consciousness. And I have, in my playlist about non-duality, I have a couple of videos where I talk about the duality consciousness. And really, what you see in the political arena today is that the duality consciousness is outplaying itself in a very extreme form. And that's why politics is becoming more polarized. The two opposing sides of politics is becoming more and more confrontational, more and more angry, more and more aggressive towards each other. So as a spiritual person, I think we many times we come into the world with a good intuition based on experiences from past lives. I mean, I'm just thinking about this again. I just cannot support this with my soul energy. Well, I think what many spiritual people can't support is the polarization in politics. We can't support either this side or the other side because we intuitively feel that both of them are unbalanced. And we have seen from past lifetimes how politics, when it becomes unbalanced, it just never resolves anything. It only leads to more and more conflict. And as spiritual people, I think we are often fed up with conflict. So what I would say is, if you have these kind of feelings, follow your intuition about this, but ask yourself, why do you have the intuition? And I would say that many times we see from past lives that, first of all, politics can become polarized, but we also see how politics and religion can mesh and how this has led to some very undesirable results in the past. You look at, for example, Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. Why were they called Dark Ages? There was very little innovation, very little growth, very little experimentation. There was some, but not very much, certainly not compared to today. And why was that? Because this was a society that was completely controlled by power elites. There was, first of all, the Catholic power elite, which claims to have, infallibility from the Vicar of Christ, the Pope. So their doctrines were infallible. But the Catholic Church had anointed kings. And the claim was that these kings were actually really anointed by God because they had special abilities to rule. And they had then anointed a noble class that owned all the land and all the means of production. So basically the population was slaves of this noble class and the kings and the church. And so I think that many spiritual people who are born in democratic nations, we have this intuitive sense that it's necessary to separate church and state. And again, the person is, obviously it seems to me that the person has grown up in the United States because he knows a lot of people who are pulled into the Trump-Musk thing, as he says. And in America, of course, politics are more polarized than almost any other nation right now. Many people I know from America, they were brought up to see themselves as either Republicans or Democrats. And the two parties have just become so polarized over the last 20 years that I think many people, spiritual people, they just can't deal with it. I mean, we can't really support it intuitively. But why is that? It's because we're sensing there's something wrong there. First of all, the polarization, but also this church and state thing. Because what's the foundation for the American Constitution? It's the separation of church and state. Why did the Founding Fathers want this separation of church and state? Because they saw what happened in Europe when there was a blending of church and state. It was almost impossible for the people to get out from under this slavery to the power elite, because it was supported by God, supposedly. And they didn't want that kind of a society. And so again, the person is saying, I just cannot support the MAGA movement with my soul energy. But maybe it's because intuitively from past lives you understand what is written into the Constitution, separation of church and state, and you see that the MAGA movement does not respect the separation of church and state, because it's very highly dominated by Christians, fundamentalist Christians in the United States. They don't want a separation of church and state. I mean, to be brutally honest, they want to create a Christian version of the Sharia law that you have in many Arab countries, where the law, as they interpret it from the Christian scriptures, that should determine the laws of the land. But that's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. So I think many spiritual people sense this. And that's why I'm saying I think many spiritual people can very quickly increase their intuition to see that there's got to be a different approach to politics that isn't so polarized. I actually happen to think that many Americans are fed up with the polarization in politics. And most Americans are more in the middle of the road, and then there's two groups that are polarized towards the extremes. But I don't think they represent the majority whatsoever, no matter what they might claim, either side. So I think it's, I think if you're a spiritual person and you don't have this, you can't really engage yourself in politics, it's very important to step back and first of all realize there could be an entirely different approach to politics than the polarized approach. But how do you then achieve that? How do you avoid the polarization as a spiritual person? And I think it starts with setting your priorities straight. So Jesus made a very interesting statement. He made several interesting statements. One of them was, he was asked, what's the most important point of the law? And he said, to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a priority there. As a spiritual person, you are first of all looking up vertically. Your higher self is more important to you than any identification down here. And I know that in the world, we have all been brought up to identify ourselves based on a lot of outer characteristics. Your sex, your nationality, your ethnicity, your skin color, and your political opinions. So for most people, there's all of these things floating around in our sense of identity. I've often talked about in many of my videos, there's 4 levels of the mind. The identity level is the highest, and then the mental, then the emotional, and then the physical. And so the identity is the highest, it's the top of the pyramid, which means that everything that is in the identity mind sets the parameters for what happens at the lower levels. And that's why for me, it's obvious that as a spiritual person, you strive to build a new sense of identity as being a spiritual being, not an earthly, not a human being. In other words, we are brought up to have all of these things in our identity mind. But as we walk the spiritual path, we clear out some of these worldly things. It doesn't mean we necessarily lose them completely, but we push them down to the mental level. And what I mean with that is very simple. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Or are you a spiritual person? And in your identity body, there's only a spiritual sense of identity. Now, it may be that in your mental body, you have certain opinions and beliefs and observations that makes you lean towards this party or that party. But if you are really a spiritual person, your politics should not be in the identity body. It should be in the mental. So it's just something you choose to believe or express yourself through as a spiritual person, but you're not identified with it. Because what you see in this polarization that has happened in American politics is that people have it's like they've solidified a political identity as their only identity. And I have seen this in people I have known for many years who were in spiritual movements, studying spiritual teachings, walking the spiritual path. And I would have said, 10 years ago, they identified themselves as spiritual beings and they were not really attached to anything in the world. But now they have shifted, and all of a sudden now they're identifying themselves as Trump supporters. And to me, it seems that this identity is more important to them than the spiritual identity. And the reason why I'm saying that is that as some of these people, you can't talk to them anymore. You can't have a neutral discussion about things, especially not about Trump. You really cannot have a neutral discussion with these people because they are what I would call missionaries for Trump. They're on a mission to convert you to agree with them about Trump. And they just can't leave you alone if they sense you are not agreeing with them. They have to try and convert you. And quite frankly, it's a very aggressive energy. And I think that's also what the person is expressing in this question is, you just meet this very aggressive energy, and as a spiritual person, you're saying, why would I want to deal with this? Why would I want to have anything to do with it? So I think if you set your priorities straight, then what opens up for you is that you can have a different approach to politics, where you realize that politics isn't the most important thing in the world. The most important thing is your spirituality, your raising your consciousness, and in a sense also the humanity. Because as Jesus said, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what I call humanity. You're loving other people, and therefore you're not trying to force them. You are giving them a space to be who they are without this missionary approach. Now, another thing that Jesus said many years ago, you can't serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. And many people interpret that to mean money, but it's not just money. Because mammon is a symbol for what Jesus called the prince of this world, where he also said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in me. And that means that you are first of all identifying yourself as a spiritual person. The prince of this world is everything in the world, other people's opinions and ideologies and ideas that are pulling on you to identify yourself based on something in this world. But if you really, truly understand what the spiritual path is about, you will not let the prince of this world pull you. You will stay clear. God is your first priority, the spiritual growth is your first priority, and your master is spiritual growth, it's spirituality. It's not the things of this world. This doesn't mean, again, you can't engage in politics, but you do it with a clear priority. This is not who you are. This is not the most important thing in your life. This comes lower down from your spirituality. And Jesus also said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. So, again, your priorities. There are certain things in the world that as a spiritual person, you don't need to engage in them. You don't need to worry about it. But then there are other things where you can do it from a spiritual perspective. And when you engage yourself in something in the world, you do it from this clear priority that you are spiritual. And what do I mean with spiritual? Well, in this context, it means many things, of course, but in this context, what I mean is you're neutral. You're not allowing the prince of this world to pull you into this camp or that camp. I mean, this is what the person is saying. Something about the MAGA movement doesn't sit right at all. Certainly not the other option either. And I personally feel the same way too. I didn't grow up in the US. I don't see myself as a Republican or Democrat. But I have experienced many times that if I say anything about Trump that isn't fully supportive of Trump, then they always accuse me of being in the other camp. And I'm not neutral, because I should be, if I say something critical about Trump, I should say something critical about the other side as well. I just don't see how that's necessary. But anyway, what I'm saying is, you can actually strive as a spiritual person to bring this neutral, humanitarian approach to politics, and also a practical approach to politics. What works, what doesn't work? Do we have experiences from the past with certain things, and have they worked out in the past, so why should we think they'll work out now? And you can just strive to be more neutral and take a more reality check, balanced approach, humanitarian approach. What are the human consequences? For example, if you indiscriminately fire thousands of federal employees, are these real human beings that are having their lives destroyed by this? And should that be taken into consideration? Or can we just treat them as non-humans and we just fire them because they are actually, even though they work for the state, they have now become enemies of the state? I mean, it's not really a humanitarian approach, is it? So I'm just trying to say here that the person is asking the question, and I totally understand it. I think many spiritual people right now feel they don't want to deal with politics. They almost feel like powerless to do anything constructive, and they feel like they're paralyzed almost. How do you even approach politics in the current environment? And I agree that's not easy, but I do think as spiritual people we have options. We can strive to be neutral. We can strive for a more humanitarian perspective, and we can draw comparisons to what's happened in the past. So people see that perhaps the polarization has simply gone too far. So I have a video where I talk about Trump angst. And what I'm saying is that America is now in a school of hard knocks. And it's just a matter of how hard do the knocks have to become before people say, oh, this has gone too far into one extreme. But as spiritual people, we can bring that perspective that do we really have to go from one extreme to the other in order to find out that neither of them work? Or can we look at the past and say, what if we found a more humanitarian, balanced approach to this? Where, as it used to be, for example, that Republicans and Democrats could cooperate across the aisle because they could see what was best for the whole. And can we not possibly get back to that? Well, right now it seems impossible, but who says it has to stay that way? So the other thing I wanted to say about this, the person says, so many friends and acquaintances in spiritual circles are all into the Trump-Musk thing. So I feel this terrible sense of loneliness and uncertainty. And I think the uncertainty comes because you're not really clear in your mind. As I said, you haven't set the priorities. You're first of all a spiritual person, everything else comes second. That will help you overcome the uncertainty. And then striving for this balanced, neutral approach to politics would be another way. But in terms of feeling lonely, I understand this. But it has been my observation that you can certainly find spiritual movements that are completely neutral about politics, completely unengaged in politics. So if you're a spiritual person and you know people who have become, as I described myself, you have become so polarized by Trump that you can't interact with them anymore, try and find some kind of spiritual movement that's completely neutral. It doesn't engage in politics whatsoever. Or you can potentially find a movement that's big enough that there are some people that are not in politics. I was in a movement myself, an American movement actually in the United States in the late 1980s and 1990s, and it had some clearly political aspects. There were many people that were engaged in the political field, but there were also many people in the movement that were just there for the spiritual growth. And since I wasn't from America and wasn't into American politics that much, I just gravitated towards the more spiritual people, and I had more interactions with them. And so I could be in a movement that was, fairly polarized politically at the time, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it was a problem. I just focused on the spiritual aspect. So I think you can find a way to overcome the loneliness and find people that are, focused on the spiritual growth. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with that. For many years, I wasn't into politics whatsoever. But then I came to a point where I felt I had become more neutral about politics, and I could engage. I could allow myself to express opinions about it. And this is one thing that I understand where the person is coming from, because in the current political climate in the US, it is difficult to be neutral about politics because, as I said, if you say anything remotely critical of Trump, the Trump supporters will accuse you of being biased. You are in the opposite extreme. But are you? I mean, seriously? Are you really? I look at it this way, that we have had a world order, for example, for 80 years, led by the United States and NATO, that has secured the freedom, the democracy, and the prosperity of Europe, the US, Canada, and other nations, the democratic world. And when Trump does something, says something that brings that world order into question, is it really anti-Trump to point this out? Because the way I look at myself is, I'm not anti anything. I am pro-democracy. And if somebody accuses me and says, you're anti-Trump, I would have to say, no, I'm pro-democracy. If that makes me anti-Trump, perhaps it's Trump who is anti-democracy. And I understand that doesn't help you get along with people, but it does help you bring a different perspective. What are we really for here? Are we for democracy? Are we as spiritual people? Because again, and this may be another topic, probably too big to go into here, but I know there are people, as I said, they've been in spiritual movements for a long time. Now they are really pulled into the Trump orbit. And they're not really pro-democracy, because they think that a system where there's a strong leader is probably better than democracy, because democracy is too weak and indecisive and this and that. But I'm a spiritual person, and I am pro-democracy because I see this is the way to bring humanity to a higher level of awareness, of a sense that we are all in the same boat, and we are all in this together, and we have to make decisions and take part in our society. What is the opposite of democracy? It is, like I said, the Dark Ages, where the population were virtually slaves by a small elite. This is the society we are moving towards, and more so in the United States than most other democratic countries. As I explained in my video about Trump angst in the end, where I talk about the real problem is the power elite in the US and the income inequality. That's a result of having a society with a strong leader, because if you look at it historically, every society that ever had this autocratic leaders, they are elitist societies, because there's a guy at the top who's infallible, but he can't carry out everything alone, so he has to have an elite around him, and they always get power and privileges beyond the population, and they want the population to basically be slaves who do what they're told. They're the worker bees. And it's the medieval feudal lords, they were sitting in their castles behind thick stone walls, and today the billionaires are sitting in their mansions or sailing around on their yachts, or they are now in Trump's government. How many billionaires are in Trump's government? You think they're going to do what's best for the working people? I just can't see that happening. So all I'm saying here is, I think as a spiritual person, we can speak out about politics in a more neutral way, where we try to find topics that aren't just about party politics or personalities. I'm just, and another thing I would say about this is, if you have your priorities right, that you are first of all a spiritual person and that your politics are down here on a mental level somewhere, I can't see how you can be pulled into this, what I see in some people with Trump, this idolatry. It's almost like this, they have this, it's almost like a veil over their minds. He can't do anything wrong. And whatever he does, there must be some reason for it that will turn out well in the end. And, you know, it's almost like this belief that he has some magical ability to solve problems. But Trump is just a human being like everybody else. He has a certain capacity of his mind like everybody else. There are problems that have no solutions. There are problems that have no easy solutions. There are problems that don't have a black and white solution where you say, oh, we just do this and then we'll solve our problems. And I think when you have that clarity in your identity body and your identity mind, that you are a spiritual person first, you can't really give yourself into this blind belief that this person can solve all the problems that nobody else has been able to solve. There's no magic wand there in politics. We have problems that require cooperation and require difficult decisions, not just easy saying, oh, we just get rid of these people, or we just do this and we just do that and we solve the problems. And I think once you are clear that you are first of all a spiritual person, I just think you will see Trump as just other politicians. He has different policies, yes, but he doesn't have any magical ability that other politicians don't have. So you can agree with his policies or disagree with his policies. But I'm just saying, you don't have this obsessive compulsive need to reject or explain away anything that sounds remotely critical of Trump. Because if you don't have this idolatry, you can just look at policy and say, are they going to work or are they not going to work? And who are they going to work for? You can, for example, say, okay, if you limit Medicaid and Medicare and give enormous tax cuts to the billionaires, is it really going to improve life for the American people? I mean, seriously, neoliberalism has been dominant in the Western world for decades, and the claim is also always the rising tide lifts all boats, but it just hasn't happened. That's why most people in the middle class in America feel their living standard is going down. And I understand that many of these people, that's why they voted for Trump. But as I said in my other video about Trump angst, the problem here is that money has been funneled upwards to the elite, whereas 30, 40 years ago, the people had much more of the money, and therefore their living standard was better. That is the problem. But you think that giving tax cuts to the billionaires is going to solve that problem? So that's why I'm saying you can look at policies and look at them neutrally as saying, what is going to be the effect of this? And who is it going to be an advantage for? Instead of blindly believing, oh, well, if Trump says it, then it must be right. And anyway, I realize I'm going off on a tangent here, but I just think that as spiritual people, number one, set your priorities. You're first of all a spiritual person. Your identity body, there's nothing there except your spiritual identity. Politics is down here on a mental level. On a mental level, you can agree or disagree with things. But what I'm trying to say with this is, what I see in these people that are the Trump supporters, they are so identified with Trump that they feel threatened by any kind of criticism. And the reason why you feel threatened by something is that something is in your identity mind. You are identified with it. Therefore, it's almost a matter of life and death for you. There are people who it feels like it's a life and death issue for them to uphold the belief they have in Trump. But if you have your politics down there in the mental level, you can just discuss politics. You can agree or disagree, but it's not a matter of life and death for you. You're not so identified with it. And I just think that's what we need to strive for as spiritual people, find that kind of neutral approach to politics, because render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, Mammon, the prince of this world, and unto God that which is God, spirituality, your identity. Who are you? A spiritual being or a political animal?